You may be seated. So a few weeks ago, in a nod to the Olympic platform divers, I assume, the New York Times reposted one of my favorite films of all time. Not a review of the film, not an interview with its directors. They posted the entire 16 minutes of a documentary titled 10-Meter Tower. Did anybody happen to see it? I first saw it 7 years ago when the Times first shared it. I took the clickbait that day, thinking I'd watch for a few minutes and then go on with my life, but I couldn't look away. And I'm just as convinced now as then that if I watched 10-Meter Tower every day for the rest of my days, I'd be a little wiser, a little kinder, maybe a little more fully alive for it. The concept was simple. Two Swedish filmmakers recruited people who'd never stood on a 10-meter diving platform before. That's 33 feet to you and me, by the way. I actually brought a tape measure in here Friday and confirmed that that's about twice as high as the tips of these stained glass windows. Each volunteer was given the equivalent of $30 to climb the tower, walk to the edge, and try to jump. Just try, that's all. With cameras rolling, of course. So one after another, ordinary people climb atop the platform, creep to the edge, catch their breath, step back. A heavy-set woman in a bikini fans her face with both hands after looking down. She mutters what the caption says is Swedish for uh-oh. She fans herself some more. A 60-something woman with curly blonde hair steps up cautiously. She's wearing a modest blue swimsuit with long sleeves. She walks to the edge. She shrinks back. She bends over, puts her hands on her knees and her head down until her breath returns, which is when I realize mine has too. A thin young man in striped orange trunks does a lot of waving, toe-touching, torso flips, flapping of his arms in an elaborate preparation rite. In other words, he does a lot of not jumping off the platform. And then the screen splits in two. On the left hand, a handsome, muscular guy with dark, close-cropped beard appears, standing very still at the edge of the board. And in the other frame is a girl who's maybe 10 or 11 years old. She's several paces back from the edge, but she's gathering something within herself, you can see. The man on the left just keeps standing. But the little girl finally cocks back her arms in her best starting line stance, says quietly to herself, "All righty, let's do this." Inhales, grabs her nose, and runs off the end of the tower. As you can probably see, I'm fighting an urge to narrate the entire 16 minutes to you. I want you to meet Linus and Frida. I want you to hear their gentle, nervous encouragements and then cheer them when they each finally take their plunges. I want you to watch the two young men, one black, one white, who throw a round of rock, paper, scissors atop the tower. The loser pacing back and forth until he finally smiles and touches his heart, says, "Love you," and steps off. I want you to meet these people I've never met. These people I know almost nothing about except for this. I've seen them when they were afraid. I've seen them all when they were trying to be a little bit brave. And whether they jumped or whether they cursed and climbed the long ladder back down to safer ground, I wanted nothing but the best for each one of them. And neither would you. I guarantee it. Whoever you are. Neither would you. In a time when fear is used so pervasively as a way to control, intimidate, manipulate us into angry and frightening coalitions, watching a little film again made me wonder, is there a form of fear, or is there a relationship with our fears that really is the beginning of a kind of wisdom? I know fear can make us dangerous and cruel. I now know fear can also make us tender and kind, how it can actually fill us up with care. The old story of how Solomon became wise might have been a familiar trope already by the time the ancient Hebrews wrote it down. It begins with the question of what you would ask for if you were granted one wish, doesn't it? It's Aladdin's lamp and 100 terrible jokes and thought experiments that are so universal, we know by the time we're second graders that the fine print in all the stories says you can't wish for 3 more wishes. But this telling is a little different in a way I'd always overlooked. Solomon's afraid, isn't he? The great and complicated King David slept with his ancestors and was buried. Solomon's next in line for the throne, and we're told Solomon loved his father's God, Yahweh. But he also made sacrifices at the high places, which is to say he hedged his bets and prayed to other gods as well. Curiously, he's not condemned for this here. God comes to him at Gibeon, one of those high places where he'd offer 1,000 burnt offerings. God comes to Solomon in a dream and says, "Ask what I should give you." And the fine old game we love is on. But Solomon's in a very particular situation. His father's dead, and the Hebrew people are now his to rule. The young king is quite sensibly afraid. "I'm only a child," he tells us. "I don't know how to go out or to come in, and your servant is in the midst of the people whom you've chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted." Solomon is afraid, but his fear is not the self-protecting fight or flight form of the emotion, is it? It might even be more like the fear of those people atop that tower, that kind of fear in whose presence things get suddenly real. Fear that brings a kind of focused clarity in which everything unnecessary, like our false and posturing selves, falls away, and nothing but the truth of us is left. We may be honestly afraid that we're not up to the task that's been set before us. But in this true, transparent self, that fear can become a humble tenderness and kindness, especially when the task involves tending to people we care about, just as Solomon clearly did in the story. When our fears arise from a worry, not that we won't be perceived as strong or in control, but that we won't be able to actually help people who've come to matter to us, that fear can be the beginning of wisdom. This wise old story seems to be saying. Surely a blindness of our present age is the notion that we only need sufficient information and better processing power to live well. Wisdom says otherwise. Wisdom's always been more than shrewdness or raw intelligence. The ancients knew all about these useful human capacities as well. But as the Greeks would come to put it, wisdom is love of the good, the beautiful, and the true in equal measure. And its end is a flourishing human life with other people. In the Proverbs attributed to our friend Solomon, wisdom is personified as Sophia, a woman who cries out to us from the busy city street, who raises her voice in the square so we'll hear what she has to say and come more fully alive together. Well, if church is somehow still of use to lives like yours and like mine, surely it must be as a place where whatever we're afraid of doesn't send us away from each other or set us at odds, but breaks us open to the God-given humanity we all share. And this is the beginning of wisdom, is it not? Heeding Sophia's call to be transparent to the good, the beautiful, the true, even and maybe especially when she finds us a little afraid. As you may know, this weekend we're in conversation with people from Gema Studio in Detroit, one of the design firms that may help us attend to the site on our block where some of our fellow human beings were bought and sold in the 1850s, even as our spiritual forebears came and went to church in this very room. Some have said this kind of work is an unnecessary, even unhelpful attempt to settle a historical score or displace a little white guilt maybe driven by a fear that we might not make the most politically correct response. I'm not saying I or any of us are entirely free of such motives. We humans are flawed and complex creatures. But the other night, Ardell happened to pull up on her phone the short video about the service of remembrance and reconciliation we held here 6 years ago. And we watched it for the umpteenth time as we walked along the busy Friday night sidewalk on Cooper Street. And even on that tiny screen, as the names and ages of the women and the men, of the children and even infants who'd been trafficked here were read, I was moved all over again. But this time, it was the faces of the crowd in the church that day, people I know and strangers I've never met, that moved me most. Because they were so obviously not the faces of people who'd been manipulated by some clever show. These were the faces of people who'd been broken open, the truthful faces of unprotected selves, transparent selves with the humanity and the wisdom to simply pause and be present to the painful and frightening truth and grieve a little before deciding what wisdom might be calling us next to do. What in your life has broken you open in such a way that your false selves fell cleanly away in a moment? Maybe it was looking down on the world from 10 meters up, suddenly realizing that whenever we step to the lip of our lives, the old and the young, the confident and the worried ones, the true self in each of us is courageous and afraid at once about what's to come. Maybe it was seeing clearly the cruelties we humans are capable of when we don't tend to our fears with sufficient wisdom and care. Maybe it was simply remembering that we belong to one another, all of us, realizing that while we may not be monarchs or rulers of great nations, we really are the keepers of our sisters and our brothers in this human family. Or maybe it was joy or gratitude or wonder that broke you open once to the self you truly are. Whatever it was that brought you to that place, perhaps the reason we need other people when our lives do break open like that is to bear witness to something we sometimes cannot see for ourselves, to bear witness to the place in each one of us, each one of God's children, really, that was made to love what is good and beautiful and true. That place within every human heart, down beneath our falser selves, where wisdom and courage are still to be found. Could it be that God has drawn us here, to this place, even today, to help each other bring that very courage and wisdom forth?